Keir Starmer's his entire brand is about stability, right? He can't shut up about being strong and stable, can he?
Yeah.
Right? Because he's not given us any kind of real like substantive policy platform that would change anything in a kind of fundamental. And when you've got people like the notorious JOB and Ian Dunt talking about how Rishi Sunak was going to be sensible adult governance, right? I genuinely think that the Tories poll numbers will rocket back up in a few months' time or whatever. And the thing is, obviously, we've seen these kind of attack lines from comparing Keir Starmer to Jeremy Corbyn, right? No matter how many times Keir Starmer explicitly says that he's the party of business or whatever, which is obviously incredibly cringe for a normally left-leaning party to be doing, right? The party of the union movement, right? Banning his own MPs for being able to stand on picket lines with these people, right? They're still making these attack lines, and it's incredible the amount of time as well that this is being spent, where the liberal journalists are going to be complaining about this stuff and saying that, oh, the Tories are going to be using these same attack lines, and we can't do that. I'm like, well, hang a minute, the rat's been let out of the cage now. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, right? They spent all of these times demonising the Corbyn years, and no matter how many times Keir Starmer tries to say, oh, we're a different party now, we've been remade the image, the attack lines are still going to exist. They're not going to stop. And the media are obviously entirely complicit in all of this, right? And the crazy part is because over the course of the Boris Johnson period and the Liz Truss, the very short Liz Truss period for what it was, Keir Starmer was positioning himself and the Labour Party as being the party of stability, right? The reason why the Tories had tanked in the polls has nothing to do with anything that Labour had done or any vision they were setting out, any kind of policy platform. It's because the vast majority of the Conservative voter base is entirely tied to people who own property, right? These are people who own their own homes, the people who vote Conservatives because it protects their own existing asset value. And this trust abandoned that by implementing crazy economic policy that didn't actually force the Bank of England to increase interest rates, but they did. And these interest rate rises led to increasing mortgage costs. They didn't actually need to raise interest rates, but they did anyway. That's a story for another time, but all you need to know is that because of Liz Truss, interest rates went up, for better or for worse. This impacted people's mortgages, and so the natural Conservative voter base found them to be an unstable party, right? That was the line that Keir Starmer was selling, his ability to be able to beat the Tories on. Now that they had kind of ruined their kind of credentials as being economically sound, fiscally responsible, right? The party of sound money, the party of stability, that was very, very easy for them to be able to jump on that platform, right? But now that's stopped. Like Rishi Sunak again is somebody who is almost certainly going to be given a huge amount of buoyancy from the fact that in the leadership election, up to the point at which Liz Truss had been chosen as the leader, he'd spent the entire time critiquing the Liz Truss economic platform for what actually came true, right? He made all of these predictions about the run on the pound, about the the drop in the increase in bond yields, about the increase in interest rates to 6 or 7%, right? Which is literally what happened, right? He'd made all of these claims previously to condemn Liz Truss's economic platform, and they all came true, which lends huge amounts of economic credence to his own fiscal credentials as someone being a leader of sound money, which was he is definitely more trustworthy on the economy, for example, than Liz Truss is. I'm not saying that he isn't, right? But this perceived stability is now being retained. I mean, even Jonathan Rentle was posting an article in Independent today saying that Rishi Sunak can be trusted because he got all the big calls right. But because Keir Starmer has offered nothing, apart from being the Tory party of old, being a stable government, a stable governing party, now that Liz Truss has gone, look what's happened to the polls, right? So this isn't like a kind of generic ballot poll. It still looks pretty good for Labour, but you can see that their lead has dropped by 11 points in the space of a week since Liz Truss has gone, right? That's a major polling shift again, right? But then you look at other polls, for example, Best Prime Minister, Sunak now leads Starmer. If you look at who to trust more in the economy, Rishi Sunak now leads Keir Starmer. That poll lead is incredibly temporary, right? I made the call, right? I made this call when I was chatting to Kev on his stream a couple of days ago, that I think that the Conservatives will come back and we'll have a hung parliament next election. Obviously, the media are entirely complicit in this because, for example, right, Owen Jones put a good segment on this the other day where The BBC will put out a segment saying that they said two things. They said that the Chancellor's job is to balance the books, and that there's going to have to be Rishi Sunak is going to have to look at what spending cuts he is going to make. Newsflash, he does not have to make spending cuts. We do not need to have austerity 2.0. That's not something that needs to happen. The existence of this black hole is a creation of the neoliberal viewpoint, the monetarist viewpoint of our economic system, right? We can have a budget deficit. That's fine. Deficits are fine. That's not a problem. The increasing public debt is not a problem. We're still only 80% of our GDP compared to Japan, where it's like 250%. They've not had like a huge recession or anything like that. The worst thing that we could do with a recession around the corner is end public spending to fill this kind of this hypothetical black hole that's been touted by the media, which they've been complicit in making this neoliberal framing of the issue, right? By saying we need to get the finances under control. Now, the real interest rates were the only real issue that anyone had an actual problem with, right? And obviously bond yields too, which have now gone down to bond yields lower than what they were before Truss and Kwarteng had control of the economy. Jonathan Rentoul has not turned into Skeletor, he's turned into Nosferatu instead, actually. That's the kind of the road that he's gone down, right? The Vampire the Masquerade bloodlines. But now that the bond yields have gone back down, right? The worst thing that we could be doing is cutting public spending so that we're more likely to have a recession. Right? We need to be investing in infrastructure. We need to not be cutting public spending, right? There is not a necessity for public spending cuts to get the economy under control and fix the black hole. If you really care about not having a budget deficit, there's a thing that you can do, and it's called taxes. You can tax the rich. There are literally, we've not done a windfall tax on the huge windfall profits of the energy producers and extractors from all of the profits they've had since the last windfall tax was announced, right? Liz Truss explicitly said that she wasn't going to do windfall tax, and Rishi Sunak has stuck to that policy platform. Obviously, we're going to have another budget soon. Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but I'm willing to bet that he won't do, considering how much Labour have been pushing for a windfall tax from their benches, right? This is a position that is only that's it's not received wisdom, right? It's not some fundamental truth that this £40 billion black hole has to be filled with spending cuts. You don't have to fill it to begin with, because deficits are fine, public debt is fine, that's not a problem. And second of all, you can just raise taxes on the rich. You don't have to cut spending to do that, right? You could do a wealth tax. You could do all these things that Jonathan Reynolds is saying that we can do, about changing non-dom status, changing tax exemptions on private schools by making them non-charitable, etc. Obviously, you can then do more on top of that to fill the black hole, whatever. But again, budget deficits are fine. There's no issue with budget deficits overall. That's not a problem in the way that the media has made it out to be. But, right, because nothing of what Starmer has said in the last, all the times this has been leader, is anything about structural change. He's gone throughout this entirely from a neoliberal basis. Remember when they had the original budget with the windfall tax in it that Rishi Sunak did, 8 months ago, whatever it was? Keir Starmer and the Labour Party wanted there to be a spending review of this programme that was there to help people, right? That is, again, another neoliberal monetarist framing of this issue. Even talking about sound money, that's monetarist framing, right? There's been no contradictory narrative of being mentioned by the Labour Party to try and move people's perceptions on this issue, right? By buying into the entirely conservative framing. As soon as you have a strong and stable, quote-unquote, fiscally conservative in charge, saying exactly the same things as Keir Starmer but doing it better, the poll numbers have started to drop, right? Because everyone's already bought into the narrative. The entire political sphere is bought into this identical narrative around how you should function, how you should govern with regards to the economy. So now that both leaders are saying the same thing, there's nothing to tell between them anymore. So obviously they get the incumbency benefit. Look at these stats as well. If I can change my screen. Sunak leading Starmer by 4 points on Best Prime Minister. Sunak leading Starmer on giving more trust with the economy. Over 10 points, right? He spent the entire time saying that he's winning on economic credibility. And one change of Prime Minister, and then 3 days later, suddenly he's behind on economic competence all over again. This is a losing battle. It's a losing game. That was always going to be temporary whilst Liz Truss was Prime Minister, and now it's gone, right? And this 16-point gap, this is going to continue to close, and they won't have, and even off this 16-point lead, they're only a few seats above, they only have a very small number of seats as a majority, right? They're not going to win by constantly validating and lending credence to their neoliberal narrative on these issues. We need a different narrative. We need to come here and say, no, look, public spending is good. People like good public services. The Tories have been cutting them, right? The only way you'll get these is with Labour, right? The energy sector is fucked. Right, we're not just going to get this by having a slush fund that we use to finance private sector green projects. We need to take public ownership of our energy sector now. The national grid publicly owned, right? The retail is publicly owned, and tell people why this will save them on their energy bills, right? Let them know how much profit is being extracted. People understand. When people were told how much money Shell were making and Centrica were making out of the energy crisis, they all agreed that was absolutely obscene. This is a radicalizing moment for people understanding where their money goes and who their payments of their gas bills serves, right? The people making windfall profits out of energy extraction and all of the other people all along the chain of privatization who strip money out of their energy sector, right? People understand that this is bad, but Labour have tacitly bought into this by saying that it wouldn't be pragmatic to engage in nationalisation on this issue. Even before the kamikaze budget, Keith was still saying all of these same things, right? So there's no contradictory narrative. He's running the entirety of this time on the fumes of the Conservatives doing bad things, and now there's nothing separating them. If the Tories don't implode or are forced up by public pressure, they'll use cultural BS, more authoritarian, racist and transphobic to call their way back to the 30% mark. 100%, Edward, right? Now that there is no clear air between either party and economic issues, because they've both bought into the austerity narrative, they've bought into the monetarist narrative, they've bought into the neoliberal narrative, they've bought into this cuts on public spending narrative, right? With minor variations on wealth taxes or whatever, and the charitable nature of private schools. There's now going to be a push for the Tories on social policy, right? Not only because their economic credibility waned because of Liz Truss, whatever, but they're picking that up somewhat. Now that they don't have to fight this economic battle anymore because everyone's saying identical things, just we'll do the same neoliberalism better than they will, they can now fight on social policy. They can now fight around the issue of trans people, right? The amount of people, you see the hashtag on Twitter, Labour losing women, all the people who are using their positions, the Labour's position on not explicitly being transphobic to attack them and saying, well, I won't vote Labour unless you are going to be transphobic. Well, the Tories will fill that niche. The Tories will fill the niche on immigration. Even though Rachel Reeves has said the Tories aren't deporting enough people, right? There's no contradictory narratives. Everyone's swallowing the same narrative, and the Tories are going to beat them at their own game, right? Never play chess with a pigeon. Because they'll shuttle over the board, knock all over the pieces, and they'll still claim that they've won, right? Never argue with an idiot, because they'll bring you down to the level and beat you with their experience, and that's what we've got, right? And they even have, when you look at the policies like for example, the refugee plan and the anti-immigrant sentiment, they have the exact foil to this as well. It's like, look, we can't be racist. We've got an Asian prime minister. That doesn't mean that means we can't be racist at all. So you can't even use that attack line against them anymore. They're going to win on the culture war issues. They're going to win on the economy, and they're going to come back and they won't lose the next election. I promise you that. 2 years is a long time in politics. People will have forgotten Liz Truss by then. And that's 11 points they've lost off their poll lead in a week. It will go, that gap will continue to become smaller and smaller over time. Unless there is a positive vision, right? A change to the system, actually giving people something to vote for rather than expecting them to vote against. And so I don't have high hopes. Because again, if, for example, as I've said, up until this point, for example, say Keith was always going in with some kind of transformative policy platform, then, if he'd have said then, oh, Liz Truss has fucked the economy, so we have to pull back and scale down what we want to do, sure, fine. Maybe I would buy that, right? But the issue is whilst we've had low bond yields and there has been the opportunity to agitate for structural changes, he's done none of that. Everything that he's saying now about not being able to do things because of the economy is exactly what he was saying 6 months ago, before the kamikaze budget, right? So we now know that it's ideological. It's not pragmatic. It is ideological. It's always been about ideology. He's a liberal and he wants a liberal governance, not socialist governance, not even social democratic governance, not even third way governance, right? Like Tony Blairish to the left of Keir Starmer. Like And before you say, oh, well, they're going to do publicly owned energy, right? GB Energy is not a publicly owned energy company. It's just a fund that they're going to use to subsidize the private sector to unlock the markets, in the words of Jonathan Reynolds. People don't even remember Theresa May. Well, they even remember David Cameron. All the liberals on Twitter, right? All the liberals on Twitter saying, I wish we could go back to 2012 when the Olympic opening ceremony made us feel like a real country. I wish we could go back pre-Brexit. Because none of these people, right? None of these people ever lived through what austerity did in 2010 to 2016. They were not one of the 330,000 people who lost their lives to austerity. They weren't David Clapson, who died, right? Who died with an empty stomach and hypoglycemia because he couldn't afford his insulin because he missed a fucking payment, right? He couldn't afford to be able to go and get his insulin from the NHS because he couldn't afford to leave his house because he had no money because he missed his job centre payment, right? Couldn't afford to eat. They never lived through any of that shit. So all the liberals going, oh, I missed the opening ceremony. Oh, Brexit's the real issue. No, this has been a fucking rot at the heart of governance ever since that we had David Cameron in power in 2010, right? We cannot have austerity. Now we're staring down like the barrel of another recession, just like we were in 2010. We cannot have austerity. We need to have investment. And Keith is doing nothing to counteract that narrative. So only, I mean, which we're going to the tedious point where even if Labour does win the next election, we probably won't even have the things that we need. It's really tragic. It's really tragic. And because Keir Starmer has spent far more of his time fighting internally with his own party to expel socialists, to get people off a long list who he thinks don't have the right viewpoints that he does, because he's essentially doing a Stalinist purge, like getting rid of all of the MPs he doesn't like. Everyone's talking about, oh, reselection's going to happen during the Corbyn. He's going to purge all of the new Labour Blairites from the party, which never fucking happened. Keir Starmer gets a whiff of power, and suddenly the socialists are losing their positions. Those in their positions as MPs, losing their positions on the NEC, losing their positions on long lists. They're getting expelled from the party for liking the wrong tweets, right? It's insane. And there's no media coverage of it, right? He's spending far too much time trying to get rid of the people in the party that he doesn't like, right? Rather than actually fighting the real issue, the real war that we have, and that is the war against the kind of the capital vice grip on our economic platform. And he can only do that with something radical. There was a great article which David Quantick, I got into an argument on Twitter with David Quantick about, amusingly, about how the argument for Corbynism has never been stronger. And that's true, right? 2017 might have been the real chance that we had to properly reshape the economy, right? But there's still, like, the argument as to the failure of neoliberal capitalism is even stronger now than it was previously, right? Having publicly owned energy is now a better, more pragmatic position now than it was 5 years ago. Now we're in the midst of an energy crisis. Now people are being radicalized, right? That's why we have the Enough is Enough campaign and things like that. But these people are mostly, right? A lot of these people are non-voters. But if you can, as a leftist, as leftists in my community, if you can go out, speak to your friends, speak to your people you know who you work with, who aren't politically engaged normally, right? And let them know that things can be different, right? Get them to join your union. Get them to join the Enough is Enough campaign. Get them to join Don't Pay UK. All of these new non-political party groups that we can use to agitate for change, right? Because if we show the political class that the only way that they can get our vote is by actually giving credence to some kind of alternative economic narrative, then we might be able to see some proper change. But whilst we have a political class and a political elite that are entirely beholden to the interests of capital, the interests of homeowners, the interests of a quite a small minority of people who control the handles of electoral politics in this country, we're going to get nowhere. And the Labour Party is going to get nowhere. And, after 5 years of austere Starmerism, we'll be back with the Tories again, and we won't be able to. And things, will be too far gone, right? Our generation will have no future. It's your future's at stake, folks, right? And you can't just put your cross next to Starmer and hope things will get better, because they won't. You need to start fighting for your future now. And unless you show the political class what future you want to see, they'll both continue to only just placate a small amount of tedious boomers who always vote for the party based upon which is going to increase the house price overall. So there's your choice. Which way, Western leftist?